Welcome to our continuing series of webinars. Structure of the Indian economy, how it has evolved over the past, what is it today, and how is it going to evolve in Viksit Bharat? I think this is something that many people are very interested in. And so let me introduce Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, current Chief Economic Advisor, and has been that for the last 2 years. Uh, He's also part-time. He was a part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council to the PM from 2019 to 21 before he took this over. Uh, he's worked in the corporate sector. He was a currency economist at the Union Bank of Switzerland, head of research and investment consulting at Credit Suisse. He was also head of Asia Research and Global Chief Investment Officer at Bank Julius Baer. He was also on boards of various companies. He has a postgraduate diploma in management from Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and a doctoral degree from University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He was a dean of the IFMR Graduate School of Business and visiting professor at various places, started a venture capital fund, uh, founded the Takshila Institution. So, everything you can think about from the economic perspective, private sector, public sectors, colleges in India, US, Europe, Singapore, he has done. So that's why I think he is the perfect person to explain. Let's start with, the Indian economy as it was when India got its independence, which was the first time that the Indians had to manage an economy. And what did it look like? What were the challenges and how did it evolve from there?
Adil, first of all, thank you for having this conversation with me. And so you're really casting your mind back all the way 77 years ago. So when we got independence, I think we were largely what we call an agrarian economy, dependent on agriculture output. The industrial base or the industrial production capacity of the Indian economy has been largely denuded or destroyed, because the colonizers had taken away most of the raw materials and they didn't want Indian industry to compete with them, and therefore they also made the Indian industry uncompetitive. And because of 200 plus years of colonial rule, the private industrialists or the entrepreneurial class had actually been more or less made almost dormant or inactive, because the Britishers wanted to be the source of only supply for Indian consumers, Indian households. So the Indian industry was not at all capable of contributing to growth immediately. They didn't have the resources. They had not been operating for a long time in any meaningful capacity. So we were largely a farming-based economy. And that is why in the first 20 years or so, we had elaborate 5-year plans. And there was a massive push for a government-led reindustrialization of the economy. Industrial centers, district industrial centers came up. And more importantly, at that time, I think the overall attitude in many countries around the developing world, post-World War II, was that because in all those countries, private sector wasn't particularly big or dynamic, the government has to take the lead role in creating economic development, in creating economic growth. That is why India created a lot of public sector enterprises, and most private sector activity was therefore controlled, licensed, etc., partly to give them the time and the space to grow themselves into good size, and partly because of the belief that economic development can and only be managed by the government. This was the thought process that prevailed for quite some time, almost 3 to 4 decades since independence. And then what happened was, as it happened in many countries, in India too, the weaknesses and the limitations of this approach began to show. Our GDP growth was never very bad, but never very good either, because, and then countries which were, equal in size in terms of the economy to India, like South Korea, for example, in the 1950s was of the same size as India. But then they grew very rapidly, and many countries in, east of Asia, which we know, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., of course, led by Japan, they all suddenly took off, and within one single generation, they all became developed countries, and we were still growing in a very low rate per capita income And and it had also created a lot of problems in the economy, and we were dependent on foreign imports. We didn't have enough dollars to pay for imports or buy technology and become fully industrialized power. And even China, whose GDP was very close to India in the 1970s, had begun to pull away from India and started growing faster. So by the time we completed about 4 decades, we were very sure that we had tremendous potential, but somehow we hadn't been able to realize that potential. And that is where we were in 1991, when a combination of circumstances, and we can go into that later if an opportunity arises, that enabled us to sort of embark on a new model of growth from 1990s.
I think,
And yeah,
Anantha, if I can just interrupt you, I think it's
please.
important for everyone to understand that came together and what were the actions that led to a change in the trajectory of the Indian economy in 91. You mentioned that, so I think it's worthwhile to hear
Sure.
from you.
I think that's,
What caused that?
yeah, I think basically what happened is every country has to earn some kind of foreign exchange to be able to pay for imports. Because let's say take ours for example. We had to import a lot of petrol and diesel or crude oil to refine those crude oil and produce petrol and diesel. So we need money, we need dollars to import oil and many other commodities, because we were still industrializing. We need technology, we need port handling equipment, we need big machinery to bore tunnels, and also we need generators to produce to generate electricity, etc. So many products we had to, and also for defense purposes we have to import, and we have to pay for these imports in foreign exchange, which means we have to either earn them via exporting our own produce, whatever we produce, or we need to borrow that money from overseas, or we receive investments from foreign countries, foreign investors in dollars, or Indians living abroad send money every year. So all these things are sources of foreign currency, dollars, and then we use that to pay for our imports. And India being a developing country, naturally all developing countries normally tend to have more imports because they need technology, they need heavy equipment, machinery, goods, etc., have to pay royalty and for R&D purposes. So there is always more demand for foreign exchange. So we have to keep on earning foreign exchange through exports or through investments. We have to receive them. And what happened in 1990, temporary factors also came in the way. Our imports began to rise, and oil prices went up after the war in which Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the remittances of Indians living in the Middle East, because that is the money that Indians working overseas send to their families, they send dollars, and that also temporarily dried up. Suddenly we found ourselves without any foreign exchange to pay for our imports, and therefore we had to go to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to ask for money. And normally in those days, the International Monetary Fund used to provide that funding, but under the condition that, of course, you have to change the way in which you run your economy so that you can earn more in foreign exchange, you can begin to export more. And these policies not only were given to us by the IMF, but we in India also had realized that the kind of growth we followed, which I described earlier, by allowing the government to dictate the way the industry grew and the way the economy grew, it had run its course. Problems had begun to emerge. We could never create large industrial players like in South Korea, a Samsung, an LG, or for that matter in Japan. All these countries had produced international brands, and after 40 years of after being independent, we have not created that kind of an image for India as a producer of quality goods in large scale, even though we had the size. So many people inside the country also realized that this model had finished run its course, as is no longer that useful. We need to change. We have too many controls. The government was telling the private sector, for anything and everything you need our permission. Only what is not permitted was basically a very large list. What was permitted was a very small list. So for anything and everything, to set up a new factory, to increase your capacity, to import certain things, everything needed approvals, permissions, licenses, which is what the national leader, Sri Rajagopalachari, used to call it the license quota permit Raj, which had evolved over time. And that needed to change. And that is what happened post 1991. A crisis where we ran out of foreign exchange became the catalyst for a new approach to economy, where we said the private sector will be unshackled. All the restrictions, all the chains imposed on them will be removed. They can invest. There is no need to come to the government, no need to come to Delhi for licenses, approvals, permits, etc. You can set up businesses. So we began to basically what we call de-licensing, industrial de-licensing. And simultaneously, we also began to allow foreigners to invest into India more and more, because we had a country that was colonized by a foreign power for more than 200 years. So there was a natural and legitimate suspicion of foreigners showing interest in our country. We don't know if it was for good reasons or not. But then as time wears on, we have to change, and we changed. And that is why India from 1991 onwards went into a different model of growth, where instead of government being in the driver's seat, the private sector came into the driver's seat.
Anantha, thank you. That explains quite a lot of what happened out there. And so you talked about de-licensing. And so how did the economy start changing then? Did it just accelerate, or did the structure change? In
I
that industry went up, farming didn't grow up as much, employment changed. Can you describe how in the
Sure.
first 10 years after that,
Yeah.
how it changed and for the better, and what did you see?
So absolutely, Adil, I think what happened after this kind of change began to happen naturally. Initially, of course, the economy was slow to catch up and respond to these changes, but it did begin to change. So as I said at the beginning, post-independence, immediately after independence, the economy was largely consisting of agriculture, farming output. Then the share of industry began to rise, and more importantly, the share of services also began to rise. When you say services, meaning like your medical industry, tourism, accounting, computer services, software, that began to rise from the year 2000 onwards, because as some of you may remember, in the year 2000, there was this famous problem of Y2K, where some computer code, because the year 00 could have been interpreted by computers wrongly as 1900 or 2000, so they didn't know whether the world computers would stop working. And they needed a lot of technical manpower. And by then, India, because it has started liberalizing and industry was coming up very fast, a lot of engineering colleges had opened, and India, because of its size, was also churning out or producing lots of qualified engineering graduates, computer software engineers, etc. So the services share of GDP. So if you want to divide the economy into three major areas: agriculture, industry, which includes manufacturing, and services, which is everything else, which is not manufacturing, but services include banking, insurance, health, education, software industry, tourism, hospitality, everything would come under services category. And that began to grow very fast. So roughly, for example, today, you can think of Indian economy as 15%, roughly speaking, 15% comprising industry, 25% comprising industry, including manufacturing and mining, construction, etc., and about 60% is services. So from after the so-called economic liberalization, when the private sector became a very important part, very important contributor to growth, services sector became very important. Indian software industry grew very fast because we had set up a lot of good institutions of technology, Indian Institute of Technology, engineering colleges, and a lot of high-tech public sector enterprises in Bangalore area. Post-independence, you had the Bharat Electronics Limited. All these things contributed to creating an economy that was doing very well in services. Now, for students or even non-students of economics, it's interesting to know that traditionally, countries would go from agriculture they will move on to manufacturing, because agriculture produces the raw material, which is then used in manufacturing. It becomes an input, raw material for manufacturing. And most manufacturing initially begins as a low technology, textiles, footwear, leather products, agriculture-based products. That is how manufacturing first starts. And then slowly, as the economy grows, we start producing technical graduates, medical graduates, construction engineers, geological engineers, and then slowly the manufacturing itself goes to a next level, high-tech manufacturing. In the jargon, we call it higher value added manufacturing. And then once that is exhausted, then we find that growth comes in services. Banking, because as manufacturing grows, there is a need for banking, there is a need for insurance. And as people live longer, they need more health insurance, life insurance, all these things. And then country becomes bigger, other people want to visit us, tourism sector grows. This is how services grow. So agriculture, low-tech manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing, services, this is normally the path. But what happened in India was agriculture, we kind of skipped, even though there was a pickup in manufacturing, we kind of skipped that phase and went straight into services, because manufacturing also requires a lot of infrastructure, road connectivity. Our seaports must be able to handle a lot of imports, raw materials, and aviation connectivity. All these things were still relatively missing, and that is one of the reasons why India somewhat uniquely went straight from agriculture to services dominated economy. And we are trying to fix that problem now and make it more balanced. But that is where we were in the initial first two decades of post-1990s. This is how Indian economy became from agriculture to one that was dominated by IT, information technology sector, software sector, etc.
So, Anantha, if you had to just put some numbers to it, in 1947, when we got independence, we were what, the 50th largest economy, and by the end of 2000, we were what?
It's very difficult for me to remember. I know that in the 2010s, when it began, we were about the 12th or the 13th largest economy, but in the 2000 we might have been in the 20s or 30s in terms of the global ranking. I don't have these numbers off the top of my head, but I know that by 2012-13 we were mostly somewhere between 10th and 12th largest economy, and today we are the 5th largest economy in the world. The four countries that are ahead of us: USA, China, Japan and Germany, and soon we will be overtaking Japan and Germany. Yes, you are right. Just to put them in context, I can tell you one small thing. Our per capita, that is per person income, was 500 rupees at independence. Now it is 2 lakh rupees per person.
Wow.
That's a huge growth in terms of the GDP size. That is, it is not GDP, is basically what we call gross domestic product, the size of the economy, how much we produce, goods and services in a year. Of course, a lot of people may wonder how economies can actually measure every small thing that we produce, and how do you actually count the transaction done in services sector, but that will require a separate session itself. But somehow economies, two statistics departments try to estimate this output, and we have, from where we were, we have grown to 2 lakh of rupees per annum annual income, or 2.2 lakh rupees per person in India by 2024.
I want to ask you about one other transformation.
Yeah.
And you might want to take any time frame you want in it, which is the transformation of India from a primarily rural economy,
right,
to being more of a rural and urban economy today, and maybe sometime in the future becoming more of an urban economy. So any thoughts and comments on how that occurred and how that helped the economy or didn't help the economy?
So I think we are actually right now trying to, as I told you earlier, we are trying to grow our economy into a more balanced one. So we have agriculture, which is about 15%, industry is about 25%, and services 60%, I said. But industry includes manufacturing and mining. If you only look at manufacturing, we are only about 17-18% of GDP. Now, why is this so important? Because Only when you manufacture, you're able to create jobs. And manufacturing doesn't require, not all manufacturing requires the same level of skills. You can have low skill, medium skill, semi-skill, and high skill manufacturing. So it is very important, and we still continue to depend on many other countries for our products. Many things, even for example, a trolley in the airports, if you look at where it is made, it is not made in India. So it's just a simple baggage trolley. So we need to become self-sufficient in many of these areas, because post-COVID we realize that countries naturally tend to look out for their own interest, and we are missing out, and we will be missing out on key important components, whether it is our defense, whether it is our electricity generation sector, or computers or communication network. We need to have critical things, inputs for ourselves. And I think therefore we need to increase the size of our manufacturing capacity and also capability in terms of quality of know-how, etc. That is the direction in which we are proceeding. So by the middle of next decade, 2035, we should have a manufacturing share of GDP as a size of the economy of around 25%, and even agriculture, because we have so far, Indian agriculture means everybody thinks of rice and wheat, maybe followed by sugarcane and cotton, but there are multiple other things, fruits, vegetables, flowers, and then you have not only, these are all horticulture, you have poultry, you have fisheries. So there's so many other areas where we can actually expand our agriculture. It still has potential to create jobs, and we don't have that much of storage capacity for food processing. So all these areas are the areas in which we want to go, so that agriculture will be about 20% of GDP, manufacturing will be about 25% of GDP. Therefore, the overall industry share, including mining, could be about 30% of GDP, and the services sector can be about 50% of GDP. So this is the direction in which we want to go, and by then the Indian economy also will have become the world's third largest economy, with a size of about 7 trillion in the next 8 to 10 years. I'm not sure that I really answered your question, but if you want
No,
to...
that's fine. That was very helpful. I just wanted to again just bring you back and have you comment on one aspect that you
Yeah,
talked about earlier, which is you said, in terms of foreign exchange, we got into a crisis because we didn't have enough input
that's
from
right.
FDI or from
Exports.
people who send money home, right?
Yeah.
Remittances. But today, so how has that changed in terms
Very.
of both remittances and FDI and foreign investment, FPI, I guess, right? Foreign investment
Yes,
in our
yes.
capital markets. Can you talk a little about how much
Sure.
that has changed?
In fact, Adil, as you correctly pointed out, the foreign exchange we earn comes from investments. People who invest in India in businesses for longer term, 10, 20, 30 years. And there are people who invest in our capital market, in our stock markets. And also Indians living abroad sending money to their families. That is remittances. And then, of course, the exports. I'll try to give you some numbers. India, in general, India is a very large country, and large countries normally don't have big exports share of the economy, because whatever we produce inside can be consumed inside the country. That is why large economies, in the economists call them closed economies. They are self-contained. Small economies cannot consume everything that they produce, and if they only produce exactly what they need, their economy size will remain small. So small economies always have to look for export opportunities to other countries, other markets. That is why small economies are called usually small and open economies. They go together, and large and closed economies go together. So India also was a closed economy, partly because we didn't have the capacity to export like Japan, Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, etc. But we were also more interested in import substitution. That is, we didn't want to depend on foreigners for imports, and therefore we ended up making our priority, how can we produce internally so that we don't have to import. That's not wrong at all, but when you say I am not focusing on import substitution, by producing inside the country, but I'm focused on exporting to others, then the slight shift in emphasis happens. You start focusing on quality if I have to sell to somebody. But if I'm only going to substitute for imports, then what happens is I can block the imports through various actions I take, rising barriers, putting duties. Then what happens is what we produce internally, people have no choice but to buy them. And therefore quality can be a casualty there. So what happened was post-1990s, as economy became more capable of producing more, we started raising our share of exports. And today, between manufactured goods and services, we export nearly $800 billion. And our overall export size, we also, by the way, we import crude oil and export petroleum products. Even if I take out petroleum products, our total foreign trade is somewhere between 35 to 40% of GDP, exports and imports put together. It's a very high share of GDP compared to where it was 20, 30 years ago when it was barely 10 to 15% of GDP. So we have become very open, we're able to trade, we're able to export. So we are beginning to make our mark as a quality exporter in many areas. And that is bringing us foreign exchange. The second question you asked is, how much are we getting in investments? We were getting about 10, 20, $15 billion of companies wanting to invest. But lately, the number is somewhere between 70 and $85 billion per year. We are getting in terms of investments from foreigners wanting to invest in this country, bringing for us technology, know-how, new ideas, etc., and being able to make profits out of it and taking it back to their own country. And that is actually creating a sense of confidence. So India is now getting what we call foreign direct investment, FDI, on a gross basis of around $70 billion. Of course, this number keeps fluctuating depending on conditions operating in their own country as well. And the third important input you are mentioning is foreign portfolio investors, FPI. And totally, FPIs have invested more than $300 billion in India. And India used to be much more dependent on foreigners investing in Indian stock market. But in the last 4 years after COVID, in fact, Indian investors have discovered how to invest in stock market and keep the benefits for themselves, because last 4 years, Indian stocks have done so well, Indian stock market, and Indians have also benefited. But foreigners who have invested in India have actually done very well for themselves, because in the last 30 years, 1994 to 2024, Indian market has delivered returns of 7%, nearly 7% in dollars every year, even after adjusting for inflation. 7% is a very good number in dollar terms. I'm sorry, inflation adjusted in Indian rupees, high single digits, and in dollar terms, close to 7%. And then the last item is remittances. Because Indian diaspora is so big, it is present in Asia, present in the Persian Gulf, Middle East. It's present in North America, US, Canada, and in Europe, in UK, etc. And the remittances coming from Indians is now close to $130 billion. And that is why today, in 1991, we didn't have foreign exchange. We mortgaged our gold, got foreign exchange loans, and then we successfully repaid the loan, brought the gold back into India recently, several years ago. But today, India is one of the few countries in the world which has a very large foreign exchange reserves. That is, we have accumulated foreign exchange. Reserve Bank of India manages that. That number is close to $700 billion. Compared to where we were, we didn't have money to pay for more than 2 weeks of imports in 1990 during the crisis. Today, we have enough money to pay for 10 to 11 months of imports, and our economy has become much bigger in size. So this is the journey we have made from 1990 to 2024. Back to you.
And how is that, can you correlate as the economy grows and we become bigger?
Yeah.
Right? How is that translated into a higher standard of living for all our citizens?
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, the purpose of economic growth is not just economic growth in itself. Economic growth is about raising the standards of living. That is, each one of us should feel that what the kind of life we lead is better than how our fathers or grandfathers and grandparents did. and also the confidence that our children and grandchildren will have a much better life than we have. And on that basis, if you look at it, of course, one measure is, of course, the per capita income. I mean, just even in 1990, our per capita, per person income, average income, which is basically the economy's size, GDP divided by number of people in the country, was 6,000 rupees in 1990, and now we are talking about 2.1 lakh of rupees. And if I had to put it in dollar terms, in 1990, each Indian had an income of $348. Now it is $2,500 in last 34 years. This is a change. So there is more money to go around. And second, things like life expectancy, that has improved. And then the number of children who used to die before they complete 1 year, or the number of women who died during pregnancies, those have come down dramatically to almost developed country standards. And then we talk about the poverty ratio. After how many people live on a daily income wherein they cannot meet the calorie needs that they need to function, to be productive, to be healthy. That number has come to very low single digits from double digits. Of course, what is the poverty rate is something that can and should be adjusted as cost of living goes up. But today India has almost fully eliminated extreme poverty. And then if you look at the middle class, the kind of connectivity that India has today, I mean, our internet penetration, Indians in fact have the cheapest cost of data in the world. And I'm talking about middle class Indians. And for example, the number of airports India built after independence, for 7 decades until about 2014, we built about 74 airports. But in the last 9 years, we doubled that number. We now have 149 airports. And almost every major city in the country has a metro rail network. And we used to have intermittent power supply. We used to feel very happy when the lights came on after load shedding, and power used to go off for 1 to 2 hours. Today, urban India on average has 22 hours of power supply, and rural India close to about 18 to 20 hours of power supply. So the so-called load shedding or power supply getting disrupted, which was a very normal feature when I was growing up. I'm now 61. When I was in my 20s, 40 years ago, that was accepted. But today, if you ask young Indians what is load shedding, they have no idea. And we used to have to wait for months or even years to get a telephone connection. That is now on demand. To have a landline phone. In fact, our young Indians don't even know what is a so-called landline phone. And mobile phone penetration is close to 1 billion, or 100 crore Indians have mobile phones. And so these are all the various indicators or manifestation of what this economic growth, what it has meant for the average Indian. The number of educational institutions, your IITs, engineering colleges, medical colleges, institutes of management, and also in literacy rates. I mean, today, for example, most Indians complete, in the age group of 15 to 29, complete 12 years of schooling. And in university education, only about 6% of the eligible population, 15 to 29 years of age, used to go to universities. Now 30% of the population goes to universities. And in that, the ratio of women to men was very low. Only 77 women for every 100 men used to go to colleges. That number is now 97. 97 women for every 100 men. It's almost equal. So these are all, I mean, I can keep on giving these statistics, and that is what we write the economic survey for. So I think...
No, that's great. And
yeah.
I wanted to now ask you, as you look ahead, India's goal is very clearly labeled out and laid out, right? Which is to achieve Viksit Bharat, developed country status by 2047.
Right.
What do you think as we go ahead? How will the economy change for us to achieve that? What are the big sectors that will be different? What are the changes from today, right? That will be different. And I'll come back and say, what do we have to do today so we can achieve that?
Yeah. So I think when we say that we will be a developed nation, what kind of economy we will have? I think I still believe, in fact, the world, because it has changed quite a bit in the post-COVID. Earlier, I told you a few minutes ago, I said countries normally progress from agriculture to manufacturing to high-end manufacturing and then to services. But now the wheel is coming back a full circle food security is becoming so important. Climate change is making food production unpredictable in many parts of the world. So India can actually use its agriculture not only to become secure and self-sufficient in food supply, but can also be a source of export and provider of food to many countries in Asia and Africa in the years to come. So I think agriculture will still remain an important part, contrary to what economic textbooks used to say. And we will definitely become much more self-sufficient in manufacturing. And as I told you earlier, we used to be only focused on import substitution. Now we will also become a big exporter of manufactured goods as we have become. So I think what sectors will do well in India? I think there are plenty of sectors that will be important, whether it is high-end manufacturing. And today, for example, whether it is semiconductors or mobile phone manufacturing, pharmaceutical health products manufacturing, because the world relied on China last 30, 40 years for manufacturing. But there are many reasons why the world is now looking for alternatives. And while there are smaller countries which have initially benefited from this diversification away from China, they don't have the size and the capacity in terms of human capital, in terms of productive capacity, resources that India has and will have. Therefore, multiple sectors in India will do very well, whether it is manufacturing, whether it is services, whether it is pensions, healthcare, or even elder care, because worldwide there is so much of rise in aging populations as people live longer. So nursing capabilities, elder care capabilities, and manufacturing for electronics, pharmaceutical, or even low value added, what we call labor intensive manufacturing, textiles, because countries like China, Bangladesh and Vietnam are running into different sets of challenges in boosting their capacity. India has an option to grow its textile sector and also the footwear sector that can create more jobs for unskilled and semi-skilled labor. So I think as far as opportunities are concerned, they will remain limitless for India for at least for the next 20 years.
I wanted to ask you about, one of the things we talk about or people talk about in India is the growth of the startup economy.
Right.
Right. And maybe you could comment on that and how that has helped. What role does that play in our overall economic growth?
So specifically, obviously, any country, India is by nature an entrepreneurial economy. I mean, if you look at when we call what we call so-called the informal economy that are relatively, where many people operate on their own. India that way, in some sense, has been an entrepreneurial economy. People take care of themselves rather than working for someone else and earning a salary. That has been the norm for India. And I think a startup economy is exactly that, because it is about entrepreneurship, taking risks. And earlier in the 1950s, 60s and 70s up to the 80s, and coincidentally, after the crisis as India became more open, allowing private sector to grow, this entrepreneurial economy also began to thrive. That is, more people, instead of looking for a job, are able to start their own enterprise, and if anything, they create jobs rather than seeking jobs themselves. And that actually started in the developed world in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the United States. Even Europe is catching up only now. But India, I think, especially from the new millennium, from 2000 onwards, and then even more so since 2014, because of specific policy decisions taken by this government, the number of startups, what we call the new enterprises in manufacturing, in services, in fintech, financial technology, or involving digital technology, have grown so much in size that India is now the world's third largest ecosystem, or a place for young businesses, new businesses and entrepreneurs to emerge. And we have also evolved our procedures, rules and the legal system and formalities to be able to facilitate this kind of transformation. So we need both an employment-rich economy and an entrepreneurship-rich economy, and both are growing in size in tandem as we now move towards becoming one of the three large economies in the world.
Anantha, I want, you said when we had independence, we were a closed economy and we were not that dependent on the external world.
Right.
right? Or imports and exports of 15% or something like that.
That's right.
Today, of course, we are more dependent and the external world is very volatile. Lots of changes occurring out there. How does India's growth get affected by what happens in the rest of the world these days? And, or are we insulated from it, or we have to manage it differently?
Uh, no, actually, it's a very important question, Adil, that you have posed. In the next 20, 30 years, I think it is going to be a more difficult world. Uh, China, for example, began to grow very fast from 1980s onwards. At the time, the Cold War was coming to an end, and between 1990 and now, the United States had remained the dominant power. And during that phase, in general, by and large, for the last 25, between 1990 and 2015 or 16 or so, the movement or the thought process in the world was basically produce in the cheapest possible place and import it in your country, and you can generate more profits. They called it globalization. And also India also benefited because American and European companies sent their accounting jobs, back office work, what they call human resources accounting, provident fund payroll, pension fund accounting, all these jobs were all, and looking after computer systems and maintenance, all these jobs were sent to India, manufacturing jobs were sent to China, etc. Therefore, if people could not move, jobs moved to developing countries from developed countries, and to some extent it did benefit our rise as well. So that was a period when there was a much greater relocation of production of goods and services for better efficiency. That phase is over, and post-COVID, that reversal has become even stronger. Countries are now becoming, the global political conflicts are increasing, and globalization may not be fully reversing, but it is now definitely going into a slower lane and may even come to a halt or may even go back. That is, countries are now saying, okay, wait, we can't produce anywhere in the world and then import it to our country. There can be disturbances, there can be conflicts, shipments can be disrupted, or countries may ban export of some commodities and products to my country. So I have to produce many things that I want in my own country. So that is one big change that is happening. That is both an opportunity and a challenge for us. Global trade will slow down. Even as we want to now export more, global trade is going to slow down. That is one reality. And when this kind of differences emerge, investment flows also will slow down because each country will feel that investments need to happen in their own country for their own production rather than allowing their own people to go and invest somewhere else. That will also change. The third thing that is going to be more difficult for us compared to last 30 years, the next 30 years will be about this climate change. World is becoming warmer place, and people think that warming is caused by human activity, which means greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide emissions are considered as the principal villains of this. And these things are, these things become part of the atmosphere because of emission, because of running too many vehicles, petrol and diesel consumption, electricity generation produced based on coal, etc. All these things are now being seen as important contributors to the world becoming hotter. So therefore, there is a tendency to ask developing countries to reverse these things and go into using renewable energy more or nuclear energy, etc. These need investments, and we need to take care of what we have invested already in coal and gas-based power plants, and our cars and automobiles running on petrol and diesel. So all these things are going to make major discontinuity and disruptions to the way we have gotten used to in the last 50 to 70 years of growth. So these are the challenges that India faces, which other countries did not have to face in the last 30, 40 years as they were rising, particularly in Asia. And last but not the least, our own size and the fact that we have to stay very much in competition with other countries in the world and also create jobs for at least 80 lakhs people, youngsters every year. So India has therefore both an extraordinary set of opportunities and also an extraordinary set of challenges in the next 25 to 30 years.
And can you, great. I want to close on one other question, and then I'm going to ask you about the future. and your confidence level in it. One is, if you look at the countries around us,
Yeah.
right? Many countries have sort of, in a sense, economically collapsed at different points in time, right? They've just not done well, or things have suddenly gotten a lot worse. It happened with Sri Lanka, it happened with Bangladesh, it happened with Pakistan. And I don't mean anything about things around us, but what are the things that you see in India that allows for us to be more comfortable that we don't go that way,
Okay. So
economically,
yeah,
economically.
I completely understand where you are coming from, and I think if you normally go to a doctor for a health checkup, there will be a checklist. They will have a form and they will tick most of those boxes, initial parameters, as they say, basic parameters. But if you do the same thing for India now, most of those parameters are in good shape. As I spoke to you about the amount of foreign exchange reserves we have, about the volume about how much our export share of GDP has grown, and our cost of living, the increase in cost of living, and also how much of money we have borrowed from other countries or other country residents in foreign currency, how much we have. All these parameters, if you look at it, are all in very healthy levels. They're not in dangerous levels. So therefore, that we will go the path of some other countries, therefore, in a negative way in terms of economic outcomes, that is very low probability, because most of our economic health parameters, the checklist, if we tick them, we are in good health. And then also during COVID, if you look at it, many countries even struggle to transfer money to their own people, even developed countries, because people were not able to go to work. They needed money. The government was going to send them checks, but it was not that easy. Whereas India, even though it's a developing country, we were able to transfer money to Indians much more efficiently without leakage, because we have this Aadhaar, Jan Dhan accounts were opened. In fact, international organizations say that India achieved this financial inclusion, PM Jan Dhan Yojana, in 8 years, what it took other countries 47 years to achieve, the kind of coverage through bank accounts. So that helped us to transfer money efficiently. And also because we were able to do that in a targeted way, we did not overspend like other countries did. So today we have a government financial situation that is in much better shape than in many other countries. And we have shown that we can continue to grow the economy. It's becoming bigger in size while keeping some of these things in check. We are not overspending. And therefore, what we call in the economics jargon, fiscal stability or macroeconomic stability, that is very high. And then more importantly, in the years between 2011 and 20, Indian banks and Indian companies found that they had too many loans. They had overborrowed, and they had companies had overborrowed, banks had overlent, because in the first decade there was a lot of good growth, and people extended the forecast that this growth will continue indefinitely. But then we all know that in 2008 the world economy had a very big crisis, and after that the economic growth rates became a little bit slower everywhere in the world, and therefore our companies and banks had problems in paying back those loans, and banks had difficulty collecting those loans, etc. Now all those things are behind us now. Indian banking system, Indian companies have very good balance sheets, and they are in a position to invest and hire more. So in many of these aspects, India has now in the last 10 years laid a good foundation for us to grow sustainably and steadily in the next 10 years. Of course, the global conditions in the meantime have become that much more challenging and difficult, no questions about that. But I think we have a good solid foundation and base, economic health, to be able to create employment and continue to grow our economy in the next 10 to 20 years.
Another last question, I promise, which is, you've talked a lot about what governments do and, macroeconomic factors, etc. What is it that the individual citizen of India can do to help this economy continue to grow? Because, not every citizen can say, government, go do this, go do that. They don't have a role in that. So what is it that the Indian citizen can do to help India get towards Viksit Bharat?
Okay, so I think that's very important. I think one is wherever possible, whichever area you are in, there has to be a quest to continue to improve ourselves, skilling. Not everybody needs to become a master's degree holder, university degree holder, or a PhD graduate, doctoral degree holder, etc. But I think everybody has to constantly find ways to make themselves more and more skilled, more and more qualified, etc. So Indian youth and Indian public have to continuously improve themselves, expand their skill range, and no particular skill is either superior or inferior. For example, India has about 1.4 billion or 140 crore plus people, and even if 10% of them or 20% of them are going to be the age of 65 and above, and it's only going to grow because Indians are living longer now and healthily, elder care is going to be such an important area of work, of mental satisfaction, emotional satisfaction, and it's also a source of income. So learning how to do elder care, nursing, and mental health, for example, after social media became so dominant in 2010 onwards, a lot of youngsters or even middle-aged people have mental health anxiety. So therefore, mental health counseling. These are all important skills. So what I'm saying is Indian youth and middle-aged people have to keep themselves open to all possibilities of skilling themselves, making themselves economically and socially productive. The second way Indians can contribute is to also keep their physical health and mental health in good shape, because only a healthy population will also be an economically productive population. So continuous skilling, reinvention, physical health, emotional health, or the ways in which the Indian public will be able to contribute to their own goals, economic aspirations, as well as collectively for the nation to reach a place of importance and influence in the global committee of nations.
Anantha, thank you very much. It was, it was a wild ride from 1947 to today. We took you through a very long period of time, and I think you've given us a great overview of how things changed in India. And also you've given a great set of guidance to people on how things will change over the next 20 years as India goes to become a developed nation. Thank you very much for your time, and
Thank you,
good
Adil.
luck.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.